Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Bat Cave, you guys. It's 4th of July, so happy 4th. Let's see how many of these things we got left, America. I just wanted to nerd out a little bit on the Serpent by the Way stuff, you guys. This book is going to be something that you have to be, to really get the most out of this book when it's finally published, you're going to have to be like a super history nerd and a super Bible nerd. And if you're not, you're just going to be like, huh, that's interesting. If you are, you're going to be like, oh man, that's amazing. And it's just, I'm kind of like mourning inside because I'm going, the people who are super into ancient history, so much of ancient history is dictated around the Sumerians' kings list and Manetho's Egyptian list, basically the Turin's kings list. And it's so sad because I'm finding out that these things are total BS propaganda. And when you pull them out of the way and you just go, hey, there's these other kings lists around that would call BS on those other kings lists. And if you just let these lesser known civilizations, again, Egypt and Sumer were not everything. You had Assyria, you had Mari, you had these other kings lists around there. They all line up with the Bible. It's just the Sumerians' kings list and Manetho's Egyptica that doesn't, and then the Septuagint seems to go intentionally line up with them. And when you line this stuff up, this is amazing. So, for instance, we have a big fat question of if, I'm going to expand this here. If you have all this area, which is basically the core of the Shemites and the Hamites, being taken over by Sargon, where are the Japhethites? Why aren't they doing anything about it? They're the ones who Noah was appointed to increase and expand. Okay, so why aren't they coming to help? Well, they do come to help. And that's the thing is we don't get here. See, once he takes over all this, when you get the Sumerians' kings list out of the way, because the Sumerians' kings list makes it sound like these Gutians are just whoever they are. They're these tribal barbarians. And they come in after Naram Sin and just take over everything and sack Akkad, okay? Well, this is not just some riffraff from the hills that do this. I mean, you're talking about a quarter of all human population that does this, okay? Or that they're ruling over. And this is pretty consistent until the period of the Tower of Babel. About a quarter of all human population lives here, if not more. It could be up to half. The only significant civilizations outside of this that I'm finding is Egypt, which is not nearly the size of this, the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley, which is not nearly the size of this, and then there's this third civilization that honestly up until a couple days ago I knew virtually nothing about, but seems to be everything in this equation. There's a civilization called the Oxus civilization. It's also known as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. Now, Bactria is a name given to this region by the Greeks when Alexander the Great conquered it. But this is essentially Tajikistan or Turkmenistan, okay? So if you see the Hindu Kush right here, and you want to remember that the Hamites, Hindu Kush literally means river of Kush. It's named after Kush, okay, the son of Ham. And these guys come up and they colonize these rivers that flow from the Himalayas down through Pakistan. So this is essentially right down the middle of Pakistan. It's basically the border of ancient India, okay? And it's that river that the name Indus, it's actually the Indo-Aryan word for river, that the Indians get their name from, okay? But the river itself is called the Hindu Kush. It's the river of Kush, okay? Because the Indians are Kushites. They're the sons of Rama and Shiva, okay? So Rama and Shiva become the gods Rava and Shiva. And when we look at, we did this in Ezekiel 27, Rama and Shiva are the main source of spice. It says spice, precious stones, and gold. Okay? India was known for having a lot of gold. When Alexander the Great conquers it, he starts talking about how they're finding gold just lying on the ground. Okay, precious stones, all the lapis lazuli and carnelian and these different precious stones that were mined in Afghanistan came from India. And then more than anything, notice it says chief of all spices. It was the spice capital of the world. It still is the spice capital of the world. So you see what their merchants are called, the merchants of Sheba and Rama. Well, Sheba and Rama just become the god Rama from the Ramayana, and then Shiva, the god of, I think it's the god of destruction. And the main Hindu gods seem to be, Brahma seems to either mean the expanse of Ham, or the increase of Ham, or the increase of Rama. That's more likely. So Rama seems to be a deity based on Rama, but it's like the greater Rama. And this is where they start to have these ideas of there's the greater Rama, which is basically the god of all gods, and these other gods are manifestations of him. Okay, so that's what Brahma is. Vishnu seems to be their version of Enoch. It seems to be this god that is in the sky and watching, and he transcendent and stuff like this, and he sends down these avatars, and these other gods are supposedly avatars of his. Okay, that would make sense if Enoch is the first one who's transported up. And the reason I think he's Enoch is because one of his old names is Hari, which is one of the old names for Horus. And remember how I said how Horus, the whole falcon thing, is based on him being raptured? Well, there's more to that in the Egyptology, because the Egyptian symbol for a person's Ka, which is basically their spirit that would fly off to heaven or Hades or whatever after they die, is basically symbolized with their head on the body of a falcon. That's what Ka is. So the idea is this is your soul flying away when you die. Okay, where Horus is just the whole falcon, because he just flew away. The whole guy just flew away, not just his soul. Okay. So this stuff seems to be legit in Egypt, but the point is Horus was called Hiru Har. Hari or Hiru, when you see these theophoric names of pharaohs, if Horus is in their name, it's not going to say Horus in the name. It's usually going to say Har, Har. Okay, the Hari Krishna is literally based on, this is the Hari Krishna cult who's always just running around bald saying Hari Krishna. It's literally based on Hari, which is the name for Vishnu, and Krishna, which means dark one, which is the same name for Kush. So probably their original name for the Hindu Kush is the river of Krishna. But Kush is named, or I'm sorry. Krishna is actually an Indo-Aryan name, so that would have come later. So what it is a later Hindu, or a later Aryan post after the Tower of Babel name for Kush is Krishna. Okay? Which they're not terribly off in sound, and they both mean the dark one or the black one. Okay? So Hari Krishna literally seems to be based on a god that merges Hari, which is a name for Vishnu, and remember he's known for having all these avatars, with Krishna. So it's like Krishna as an avatar for Vishnu. Okay? This is not rocket science. So now you've got Hor. The Egyptians are doing the same thing. They're saying that these different pharaohs are reincarnations of these gods. And this is something that seems to happen pretty early on after the flood. And the reason they're doing it is because people are getting demon possessed by the Nephilim that were hanging around in these cities as basically warlords beforehand. So their demons are hanging around, and they literally have this period that's in Manetho's King's List and the Turin's King's List that talks about the rule of the gods, then the demigods. And the gods and the demigods are basically Utu and the ancient ancestors. So Utu they would call Aten, and the ancient ancestors, followed by the demigods, which are Nephilim, followed by people possessed by the spirits of these Nephilim after they died. Those are the three eras that lead down to Menes or Narmer, which many believe is Mizraim. I'm kind of on the. I don't really think he's Mizraim. I think he's a guy who is probably much earlier than that. and he might be based on this Mantu who happens to be a Nephilim. And I can't find Mizraim clearly represented, because we have in Phoenicia and in Canaan a name for a guy like Mizraim, and it doesn't sound anything like Menes. So it just, just having an M in it isn't enough to convince me. So these guys call these guys Mitzar and Mizor. So if Mitzrayim, Mizor, Rayim would be, so Mitzrayim could be Mizor, then they would take out the O and then add the Ayim at the end of it. So Mitzrayim sounds like it fits. If you understand how Hebrew phonology would take the O out of the way to shorten the word and then add the Ayim for the plural of the people. So Horus seems to be Hari. Hari seems to be Vishnu. So the main three gods of the Hindus, Shiva, Rama, and Vishnu, seem to be their forefathers, Rama and Vishnu, and then a version of Hari or Enoch. That seems to be who their gods are. Now, this shouldn't be shocking, because if you understand that Egypt was called Kemet, okay, Kemet would have been the feminization. They say it means black land. Okay, I don't think it means black lamb. I think Ham's wife was a black woman, and Kemet, it would have been a feminine, or the wife of Ham, okay? And she would have been the source of the dark black genes, which makes sense. Ham is not known for being black. He seems to be yellow, and he may be who the Chinese call the Yellow Emperor, okay? He seems to have that skin tone that becomes the East Asian skin tone. And his wife seems to have the skin tone that becomes the dark African skin tone. So Kemet seems to be Ham's wife, and the Jews would call Egypt the land of Ham. But we know that Ham also came up and dwelt up here near Hebron. There's this city near Hebron, and it's this tiny little town near Hebron on the road towards Bethlehem. It says the descendants of Ham dwelt there of old, so in ancient times. So what seems to have happened is that Ham was living here until his wife died. Then his wife was buried here, and the place where she's buried seems to be where they put up this Ogdoad, which is representative of Noah and his family, which makes sense because that would have been Ham's wife's family. After that, he moves up here and probably marries, because the Canaanites are descended from him, so he's probably not going to marry any of their daughters, but he's probably going to marry a daughter of like Hebrew in his old age. And then he is going to start having more kids, and those are those descendants of Ham that they're talking about. So he goes from here to here. Now his wife's dead in Egypt. He's got a young wife. That's when he seems to start to get bored, or maybe he's despondent. Maybe he's looking for, his wife's dead, and he's looking for, something to, get his focus onto something else. And that's when he and Canaan start digging up archaeology and pointing to the meaning of all this stuff. And that's when the Canaanites start spreading over here. And so you have this, so you see the Sinai right here. This is the Sinai Peninsula, the Sinai Desert. This used to be called the Wilderness of Zin. That's where it gets its name. Mount Sinai is not here. Mount Sinai is over here. But because it has the Wilderness of Sin, that's where they assume Mount Sinai is in the Christian era. And these Sinites, which would have been right next to Egypt, guess what they're going to start doing? They start out as migrant labor to build the pyramids, which should not be shocking. If the Egyptians have all this food because they have a really stable farming system here, why wouldn't you hire? It's like us hiring Mexicans to do our farm labor. Why wouldn't we? It's a poor country right next door. That makes perfect sense. And so these guys basically go over here, and these guys get really good at digging and excavating. And they're probably not just building the pyramids. They may be rebuilding the pyramids, because literally they go back to this pharaoh named Djoser, who seems to be too far back in the timeline to fit for post-flood. And so the reason your biblical creationists say that the flood, the pyramids couldn't have been built before the flood, is they say because the flood would have just destroyed everything, and the I think it's sandstone that they're built on. They said sandstone would have been too light to survive the flood, and floodwaters would have just caused these buildings to just topple over. Well, maybe it did. So why can't you just rebuild it after the flood? Again, I mean, it might be causing these things to topple over, but remember, the flood didn't happen by tidal waves. I mean, I'm sure there were some. It happened primarily by rain, and so you're just talking about this thing filling up with water, and yeah, it could have knocked this stuff over and it could shift all over, but the ark doesn't seem to have gone that far, so maybe it just toppled over and then they rebuilt it. However, that salt water would have probably dissolved and destroyed the limestone covering that was originally over it. And I'm going to suggest to you the possibility, I haven't fully arrived at this yet, but I'm going to suggest to you the possibility that the whole idea of kings being reincarnated as these Nephilim, these demigods, basically, this period that they talk about, which is a short period, it's like 3 generations they account of this, of these rule of demons, are literally people who are possessed with the demons of Nephilim that died in the last years before the flood. So this is why you have, this could be maybe 50 years of this. It's not that long, okay? And this whole idea of building these pyramids that were made to reflect like a beam of the sun as the sun rose over them was meant to create the impression to these people that these Nephilim, were beaming down from the sun and incarnating on these pharaohs when they're actually just getting demon possessed. Then the flood comes, and the pyramids basically get all their limestone outer cover wrecked or dissolved from the flood, and then they, the major blocks and stuff like that kind of get bowled over, and then they just put it back together when it's after the flood. And of course, they have all this migrant labor help from these Sinates here. They would have done this probably within the first few hundred years. I mean, again, if you got 50 years to do any building, people are like, oh, how did they move the blocks in the pyramid? They're so big. First of all, the Canaanites have Nephilim. We know the Canaanites have Nephilim because it talks about these Nephilim getting killed, including getting killed in Ham. Okay? Now you have Ham over here, so it's probably not down in Egypt that they're killing these Nephilim. But when Sargon and these guys go around and kill all these people here, they talk about tribes of Nephilim that are down here, including ones that are in Ham. So let's look at that. This is in Genesis 14. He says he kills the Zuzims in Ham. So right in that area where Ham was, that means Nephilim were there. Which means you've got Nephilim at least as far down as here. They could be helping these guys with this rebuilding the pyramids thing, okay? Now remember, Ham is still alive when all this stuff is going on. Now, I don't know for certain that the Nephilim among the Canaanites could have started later, but what it seems to be is they start out digging up this Canaanite stuff, and they revive the Nephilim pretty quick. That actually makes a lot of sense to me because the Nephilim over here would have been in response to the descendants of Cain having superior weapons and taking over here. And so even though the cults that produce the ideas of Inanna and Dumuzid and making children with your dead ancestors or your dead husbands or whatever starts over here, or it seems to be based on ideas over here, the actual production of Nephilim might have started over here. And so you have Ashtoreth over here, and you have the ideas of Humbaba and stuff like this. And I believe they were two different. I'm certain that Inanna and Ashtoreth are two different people. But maybe they're not. Maybe the Nephilim always started over here. And Ashtoreth, which kind of means star wife, and Inanna, which kind of means mistress to the heavens, are just two ways of saying the same thing. There is a possibility of that, okay? But I don't think that was their original meaning. I think Inanna was the sister of, she goes down into history as the sister of Utu, which is the sun god, and then the wife of Dumuzid, which is supposed to be the lord of the dead, essentially. So anyways, these Sinates over here get really good at migrant work and construction and stuff like that, and surprise, surprise, they're going to go over here, and it looks like they're cousins, the Zemarites, become the Sumerians over here, And so the Sinaites are going to go over here and help them build or rebuild these civilizations of Sumer with their ziggurats. Okay? Now, the ziggurats probably did better in the flood because they were shorter. They were made of baked brick, which was baked thoroughly, so that would have been bitumen, or that would have been ceramic with bitumen as a lining. So these buildings that they had were designed to protect your cuneiform clay tablets and records having to do with trade and administration and stuff like that from local flooding. That's what the ziggurats were designed for. And this is probably the basis for them thinking that the global flood was not a global flood, it was just a local flood, because these guys had these small towers that were designed to protect from local flooding. So these guys, these Sinaites, are going to go over here. And remember, Ham's over here teaching Canaan how to do this. And Canaan seems to be known all the way over into India as Kanapa, which means Father Canaan, it seems like. He seems to be over here known as so Kanapa is he's called the Dark Yogi, and he becomes Krishna, but he seems to be based on Canaan, and then he's a later name for Krishna. And what I suspect is he's actually Canaan, not Cush, and they just merged the two together over time because they don't know any better. This is like 800 BC when so this would have been 1,000 years after these guys died. So what you have is Canaan moving over here, and he seems to be known as the first wise one, and I have him in the Assyrians' kings list, and I suspect that Canaan would be, I think this Yazkur-El, but I'm not sure. I think that Yazkur-El, and I could be mistaken on which guy I'm pointing to, might mean like the wise one of God or whatever. But he seems to be the leader of digging up all the archaeology and figuring out the wisdom from the antediluvian people. The Egyptians are going to call him Canum, which is where the Hebrews seem to get for the Book of Jubilees this guy Canaan, which becomes the Canaan who is in Luke 3, who's not supposed to be there. Like, I generally believe in biblical inerrancy, but I am thoroughly convinced that the Canaan that is in Luke 3 is not supposed to be in the genealogy. This was probably put into the Septuagint by Jews that went into Egypt, and they actually build a they build a temple on Elephantine Island right near the temple of Canaan, or Canum, okay? And they seem to be conferring with the Egyptian priests of Canum and putting together that Canum, or Canam, was the original source of digging up all the pre-flood stuff and learning all the mysteries, and that is exactly what goes into the Book of Jubilees, is this Canam, who they would say married in, they would say he was a son of Arphaxad. Which, why are they saying he's the son of Arphaxad? Because Arphaxad is the father of the Chaldeans and the Babylonians. So not the Amorite Babylonians, but the later Babylonians of Nebuchadnezzar and all those guys. So because that's where it happened. Remember, the Jews, they're not great historians. They have the Bible, and then they have what they're pulling together from other priesthoods like the Magi, who are Zoroastrian, and the Egyptian priests. That's what they're pulling together, and then they're lining it up with what they have in the Bible and coming up with their own speculation. And so they invent this guy named Canaan, the son of Arphaxad, and this is what they were known for doing in the Second Temple period. If you just familiarize yourself with the Apocrypha, you can tell that they're doing that. If you just read the book of Tobit, and they have Tobit basically wandering around as if these are just like a day's journey apart. Nineveh, which is the capital of the Assyrians, and then Ecbatana, which is the capital of the Medes, who overthrew the Assyrians, which is like almost 1,000 miles away. And then this other city, which turns out to be the traditional home of Zoroaster, which is just all weird, right? Like, you just pick the 3 most famous cities in the region, and this guy just wanders through them from day to day like they're right down the street from each other. And it just doesn't make any sense. Well, that's what the Jews were doing. They do the same thing. They if you read Judith, they're acting like the Jews are being led by the priesthood without a king under Nebuchadnezzar, when under Nebuchadnezzar, the temple is destroyed. There's no priesthood there. There's no one ruling from the priesthood. So they're just putting history in the Bible together and making up stuff, and you can tell they're not very good at it. They're just speculating a lot, but they're in a period of dark ignorance. Well, they seem to invent this Canaan, the son of Arphaxad, which is based on the Egyptian Canaan, which is actually the actual Canaan. But they spell it different, and so they end up with this Canaan, which becomes Canaan, and you find the Egyptians and the Hebrews just changing N's and M's around. They seem to do this quite a bit. And then he ends up in the New Testament because he's in the Septuagint. And I'm going to suggest to you that even if Luke is an apostolic writer, the Holy Spirit didn't say put Canaan in there. I think he just copied records that he had available to him, and he was doing an honest job, and he was generally led by the Holy Spirit to compose what he composed, but there's a name in there that shouldn't be there. I'm going to suggest that to you because, again, you can't... The law of contradiction still works for God. The Old Testament cannot, or the Bible can't contradict itself and be true at the same time. That's people will break their brain trying to prove why the Holy Spirit led somebody to write a contradiction in there, and I don't think we're called to do that. I think that we're called to understand that the Holy Spirit is leading somebody what to write and how to write, but there's little mistakes in there. You can compare Chronicles and Kings and find little mistakes. You can compare the genealogies in Genesis, Chronicles, and Matthew and Luke and find either mistakes or stuff that is politically motivated in there, like the removal of 3 kings from Matthew. You can't be like they're both true. Maybe they're mistakes. Maybe they're politically motivated. Maybe the Holy Spirit led them to put it in there even though it is wrong to leave these clues for us to find later. Maybe the Holy Spirit led them to put stuff in there that was wrong so you could see the degradation of knowledge among the Jews. That could be true. It's not drastic error, but it is little factual errors in there. Well, anyways, go back to the Near East. The Sinaites are going to move over here with the Sumerians, and they're going to go from being the migrant workers to the Egyptians to being the migrant workers to the Sumerians, which is why, even though this land is known to the Hebrews as Shinar, we don't have a... Why isn't the land called Shinar to anyone else? Well, they call it Shinar because when Shang dies, the father of these guys, remember, he's the youngest son of Canaan. He's going to get deified as Sin or Suen, okay? So it makes sense that the Hebrews who came out of Ur, which is where he's deified, might refer to the land as the land of Sin or Shinar, okay? Because he gets deified before Abraham comes out of there. In fact, he becomes merged with this pre-flood. That he actually gets merged with the bull of heaven, which is Nana. So Nana is a moon god, and because the moon has the crescent moon and the horns and stuff, that's the original sign for the bull of heaven before the Taurus constellation comes about. And so Nana or sign actually gets exported up to here where Abraham and Nahor and his father and their servants went. You'll find Enlil and Nana and sign all imported over here, which is basically their false trinity from down here. Enlil and Nana and Sign is essentially their version of the Father, Spirit, and Son, but it's actually based on a version of the Father that is semi-legit, literally just means chief of spirits or head of the spirits, okay? And then Inanna is the whore, the harlot, and then Sign or Nana is the bull of heaven. So they have a false trinity up here based on the harlot and the bull of heaven, the creators of the Nephilim, instead of the Father, in replacement for the original one, which was Inanna and Utu, or I'm sorry, it was Utu and Ninlil. So that would have been the Spirit and Son. So they have a corrupted trinity up here. So the Sinaites are here, and then the Sinaites are they seem to leave in 2 major waves, okay? The first wave is going to be when Sargon takes over. Remember, Sargon is going to take over, and these Sinaites seem to have a priesthood by this time because their father Sin is a major deity here, okay? And these Sinaites having a priesthood, this is why you're going to have kings named with names like Puzur sign or protector. It either means the protector of sign, so it's the protector of the land of Shinar, or the protection of a sign, suggesting that God protects this ruler. I'm going to suggest it's protector of sign because you find Puzur Asher, you find Puzur sign. It seems to be these are people who are basically OG judges, if you will, protectors of the region of Shinar and of Assyria. Okay? And so you have a dispersal of Sinites around, it looks like 1900 BC, and that's when the first culture, we have pottery and stuff that goes back to the pre-flood era in China, but that seems to be when the first culture emerges in China called the Jia dynasty. The Chinese call it the Jia dynasty. The culture that emerges, they call it the Erlitou culture. I don't know if you guys are getting sick of like Google forcing its AI onto Google searches now, but this would be where the Jia dynasty is. And you see this term 2070 to 1600. Where they count this seems to be around the birth year of Sign. That seems to be their starting point. They have a mythological era that is before this that seems to line up with the birth year of Noah, pretty close to the biblical birth year of Noah, to the birth year of Sign. And then this dynasty seems to line up from the birth year of Sign until the coming of the Shang after the Tower of Babel. Okay, so you have the actual so the actual culture where they find stuff here is called, and I'm not seeing it right here, but it's called the Erlitou culture. Seems to be close to this. So this Jia is basically where their capital and their government forms by the time the Shang overthrow it in 1600 BCE. And the Erlitou culture seems to start nearby, and it makes sense. They're on these river systems. They're starting out with basic farming and stuff like this. And then the Jia dynasty seems to take off based on this guy named Yu, who brings over irrigation. So you probably had people here before the flood, and then you probably had Chinese that came and colonized. And these guys seem to just sail little boats around the edges of the world and just find these river systems and start to colonize them pretty quick. And it makes sense. If you have Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth alive, you know basically where everything in the world is. Why wouldn't you be sending out colonies right away to tag stuff as yours for your people later on? That actually makes a lot of sense. And so these guys seem to have been doing this at least with small colonies, because all it takes is a few families. I mean, you just take 3 families and you're like, okay, you guys, we're going to go over here. There's no warfare. It's not like there's, tons of lions and tigers and pythons and stuff like that running around. It's pretty safe. So you just go and you just follow the coastlands and you find the next river up. And the Hamites seem to have been the first to do this in a very big way. The reason the Japhethites aren't doing it is because they've got the horses. So they're going overland, and that takes us to Oxum, okay? So the Hamites are going around to these river systems, and again, they seem to be doing this all over Africa, all over Asia, and all down into South America, and that's where the majority of the underlying gene pool is going to be, which is why you have these, let's see if I can find this. You can have this world map of haplogroup DNA, okay? And this is something that your archaeologists and your comparative mythologists and your historians and stuff like that are going to go on, but they're going to say that this is over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. No, it's not. There's literally like this is probably, you're going to find pottery and all this junk from before the flood, because they did this before the flood, and then after the flood, they do it again. And so after the flood, they kind of know where everyone is. And they count Y chromosomal atom here, and this is why I believe. If you see this line, this pink lines, you see these are the Khoisan people who speak with a clicking sound, click, click, click. These are people who are related to them. You see A2, A3, and they say this is Y chromosomal atom, okay? If Y chromosomal atom started in the Niger-Congo Delta, and they had farming in the Niger-Congo Delta, way back that we know at least around 1600 BCE, Why is their civilization not nearly as advanced as Sumer or Egypt or the Harappan civilization? Doesn't make any sense. And the answer is because it's not the OG. The reason why it seems like the OG, and remember, these guys are wedging in hundreds of thousands of years here for this stuff, is because you're going to have this colony of Puntites, which, remember, the Puntites come from right here, and they seem to be some of the first sailing people. The Puntites basically makes sense. They live on the Red Sea coast, and so the Hamites are all here, and they go into Egypt by land, and then the Puntites settle right here on the coast, and they probably start out as coastal fishermen, and then when the Cushites start migrating across to Arabia and to India, they're going to be their main mode of transport. Why? Because they're out there fishing. They're out there fishing to this day. This is why you have Somalian and Yemeni pirates. These are the recent ancestors of those people. Okay. Well, the Puntites seem to trade in ivory, and what they're doing is they're following the elephant herds around Africa to hunt them for ivory, and then they just find their way back to here, and then they trade in ivory, and they're trading in ivory from, at least that we know of, ancient Egypt in 1400 BC all the way forward into the days of Ezekiel, which is around 587 BC in the destruction of Jerusalem. So there's 1,000 years of these people being known to trade in ivory, which means they probably trade in ivory much longer than that. And so these guys were basically following the elephant herds around and basically grabbing their ivory and then going back. Well, guess where the elephants are? The elephants end up all around here. And you have this place right here known as the Ivory Coast, because there's so many elephants here, and you could get ivory over here when the Europeans colonized it all the year later. So it shouldn't be shocking to think that these Puntites, who are they're known by the Egyptians to have reddish skin like the Egyptians, they're probably married in with the Cushites, and then they've got probably merchant partners of the Sumerians who are also trading and moving around with them, that all go down here. So these are Puntites, Cushites, and Sumerians. Well, if you understand that Puntites are the main sailing people that move all over the world, the Cushites are the people that expand the furthest around the world in terms of colonization the fastest, and then the Sumerians are going to be the core culture of the largest, most populated people group that is going to get dispersed throughout the Tower of Babel. That's going to mean that their genetics are the farthest spread throughout the earth. Those three peoples, the original sailors, the people who spread the furthest, and then the people who were most dispersed at the Tower of Babel, are all related and involved in starting a colony here back when everyone spoke the same language. So once the Tower of Babel happens, again, you have this thing called the Bantu migration. Well, the Bantu migration, they say, starts around 1,000, but some people push it back to as far as 1600 BCE, and they seem to scatter all over. And genetically, we find the main breakdown is these people in the Pygmies, the wider people who are just called the Bantu, and then the Khoisan people. And then you see these Nilotic people are related to the Khoisan people, okay? Well, here's the Cushites. The Pygmies are probably the Puntites or the Bantu. But the name Bantu ends up sticking for these Cushites over here. And then the Sumerians probably are the Khoisan. And that's why they have these clicking sounds, which are not terribly distinct from the atl sounds, the TL sounds in the Mesoamerica. Well, that's because this would be the Sumerians who went the farthest west, and then the Zemarites, or the Mesoamericans, are the Sumerians that went the farthest east. And so you see these people groups. Notice you have this blue line that goes up here and up into Sumer. So these are the people that sail through here, and then they come down here, and notice the haplogroup types that are with them. You see C, F, D, E, C, D, F, K, okay? It just starts with A, which is the one they presume to be the oldest, and then B, C, E, and it just keeps going down. And so you see A and B and E, these different groups, because there's other people coming into Africa, and you see C, F, and E. So C seems to be right here, and C seems to be the Sumerians. Well, if you follow C, C goes here, C goes here, C goes into Australia, and these are probably mixtures of, they're either the Puntites who are sailing, or they're the Sumerians, or they're a mixture of both of them. And you see the C go all the way over here into China, And then if you go all the way over here, you see it in Polynesia. And then you go all the way over here and you see it in Mesoamerica. That's why I think these are Sumerians. I think the C type is the cuneiform people. I think that's an easy way to remember it, and that's why that's them. These other major peoples in America, these are Q, these are Sinites. And the Sinites are going to go over here, and if you see all, you're going to see some major intersections here, okay? So it's not shocking to see a major intersection around Sumer where there's a lot of mixing. Shouldn't be shocking to see a major intersection around India they're all mixing. But then you have this major intersection right here, and that's where Oxum is. And this is where the Japhethites are, and their people are all mixing by horses that can travel all over the place. So then you've got this other major intersection right here, which is right around where Noah's Ark is, and then you have this other major intersection right here, which is where Göbekli Tepe is. It makes a lot of sense when you start putting this stuff together. And then the rest of it, you notice O all over here. This seems to be the original Chinese and Austroasiatic peoples. And then you see this C3. Remember C here is right here? How do we have C here and C here? Well, the answer is because there's two Sinite migrations. And the Sinites would have been mixed with the Sumerians. And they seem to go, their first migration seems to be, remember, they're trading with the Harappans. And so they go up here. And right north of where the Harappans are in the Hindu Kush is Aksum, which is the Japhethite main city. And this Japhethite main city, you see the C over here, this is where these guys would have dispersed in the Tower of Babel, and these proto-Chinese, these Sinites mixed with Japhethites, become a major genetic group among the Kazakhs, the Mongols, and these guys, and that's why they have Asiatic eyes. Okay? Now, it probably wasn't this clean, but they may have used these overland routes to get to them. You see people that just beeline up from here into this area right here, which might be related to them. But you probably did have an original peaceful migration of Chinese here when Sargon takes over, which is why these Sinites are booking out. These are probably the nobility that were ousted from the region when Sargon takes over. And this nobility that's ousted from the region, they're going to be traveling over here with these horse guys. They're going to mingle in with these guys, so they're going to have some shared genetics with these Mongoloid and Turkish peoples, which makes sense because the Uyghurs in China and the Inner Mongolia, those are people who are mixed of Turkish and Chinese ancestry. And then they're going to start over here, and this is why the first Chinese civilization is in the north here. Okay? So there's your earlier Chinese civilization. And then after the Tower of Babel, you're going to have the rest of the Sinites, because remember, when they take over Sumer and Shinar, they're going to have puppet rulers that they put in charge. And so what they're going to do is they're going to take people who might be lesser nobility, overthrow the main nobility, and then put that lesser nobility who betrays their people in charge. Well, those Sinites seem to travel by sea because, again, they're going to have these sea trade routes, and they're going to travel around here, and then they're going to go up through this area right here, which seems to be, so this would be where Singapore is, and you would have to go all the way around Singapore and then all the way around here to get to China, and they already know these people are here, so they seem to go right up to here, which they know is going to be the shortest distance to China, where their relatives are, and then they just go straight up towards them, okay? And so you're going to have some of these people mixing with Mongoloid peoples. You're going to have other peoples. These people seems to split off, and some of them, this might be after the Shang takeover, split off and become the Tibetans, because the Shang are going to come in with a Nephilim, and they're going to take over. And these people, these later Sinites who are from the period of the Babel dispersion, they bring in astrology, they bring in human sacrifice, and they bring in a Nephilim with them. Let me show you this guy. So the Shang dynasty is, and again, your historians are going to be like, this has to be legendary because it doesn't make any sense to us. Well, it does if you have a Bible. They say that Tang is the one who overthrows the cruel final Jia, and his justification for overthrowing him is the mandate of heaven. This is the exact same doctrine that you have from the pre-flood when the Canaanites first start to overthrow the priesthoods established by Adam and Seth. Okay, So they start to overthrow the priesthood that's established by Adam and Seth and start to wage war, and they say the tablets of destiny. The Jews in the time of the Essenes, who formed the Zealots, are going to adopt a version of this doctrine, and they call it the tablets of heaven. The Chinese are going to adopt a version of this, and they call it the way of heaven, or the Tao, the way of heaven, or the mandate of heaven. That's where Tao comes from. Tao, meaning the way, is basically a way of saying fate. Okay, which is why the Taoists are so apathetic in the way that they think, because they think everything's governed by the Tao or the fate. Okay, and so for the first time, you have someone coming to China and claiming the tablets of destiny or the way of heaven, or the mandate of heaven, the Tao, as a justification for overthrowing government. Well, gee, that's the same kind of crap that goes on with Sargon and with the Canaanites, and it screams Sumer. Then they bring in augury and human sacrifice. That's what they had going on in Sumer too. And then they bring in this guy named Tang. And according to, listen to this. So there is a later Tang dynasty, and I'm wondering if they're descended from him. According to, they call them mythological sources, Tang is 9 feet tall, white-faced, whiskered man with a pointed head, 6-jointed arms, which I believe that is probably a misinterpretation of a symbol that actually means 6-fingered hands, and a bodily markedly larger on one side than on the other. Does that sound like he might be a Nephilim? I think that's exactly what he is. And he is also attributed with the writing of the I Ching, which would have been they're basically a cult manual for divination and astrology and their later philosophies. So all their philosophies that create not so much Confucianism, but Taoism and stuff like that is going to be based on the I Ching. Okay? It's basically a divination manual, so this seems to be brought by this Nephilim named Tang, who is 9 feet tall, has 6 fingers and 6 hands, and one side is bigger than the other. So he's deformed like a Nephilim. He also has a pointed head, and you see the Chinese wearing these boards on their head. That binding a board to your head to make your head pointing seems to be a Nephilim thing too. Okay? So they might be, this is a later depiction obviously, but like they might be putting the boards on their heads to make their heads pointy like his head was pointy, because that's what he was like naturally. He was a Nephilim. Well, it would make sense if this guy, remember, they could have been traveling among the Japhethites, and that's where he gets the white skin from, or the people who are marking him down have darker skin because they're mixing with Cushites over the years, because in their migrations they're coming from the south and they're mostly mixing with Cushites. But this guy could have much lighter skin because it's more like yellowish skin, but it's still pretty white. Okay, well, this guy seems to be the bringer of all their occult stuff, their pantheons. They didn't have pantheons before this. They had reverence for ancestors, which they still have today, with basically turning their house into a shrine after they die. But they didn't have a pantheon of gods. All of the false gods, all the divination, the human sacrifice, all this stuff comes from Tang and the Shang dynasty. And they show up in 1600 BC, which is, in my estimation, within about 50 years of the Tower of Babel. The other guys show up within about 30 to 40 years of Sargon overthrowing Akkad. It's a perfect match. So they're showing up pretty quickly. The second guy's by sea. Of course, you're migrating a whole people group, so it's not like they're just all hopping on a boat. This is happening over a couple generations. But they know where their relatives are. And so after the Tower of Babel, what everyone does is disperses to where their relatives are, because those are where the people are going to speak like them. It's a pretty simple formula here. Now, all this stuff works out perfectly, and I mean perfectly, with the biblical timeline if you just throw out the Sumerians' kings list and you just use the Assyrians' kings list instead. So in the Assyrians' kings list, you've got these guys. Puzur Asher means protector of Asher, and Irishum means servant of Shem. And in between these guys, you're going to have Sargon I and Naram Sin. With reigns, the exact same reign as Sargon. This is the reign that Sargon claims over Sumer and Akkad. And a reign, his reign over Akkad is counted as 44 years, and here they count it as 54 or 46 years. And this is counted as 54 or 44 years. So one of them is within 2 years. Well, the reason I believe this is different, and then this one is 8 years, the guy Remush, who is going to rule after Sargon, is counted as 9 years. Well, what happens here? What happens here is Sargon rules for his 40 years. He immediately goes up and he claims the rule of Assyria after he consolidates Sumer in that. And then he starts building his cities of Nineveh and these other cities in the Bible. And then he puts his firstborn son over that, and that's why he has the title Protector of Asher. Okay? So he's basically supplanting the original judge of Asher, the ruler of Asher, with his son. His second-born son inherits Akkad after he dies, and he's got that area on lock. So he's putting his second-born son over that. He's putting his firstborn son over their frontier because he knows that's where they could have trouble brewing. And then this guy ends up overthrowing his brother because his brother can't put down the rebellions of the Sumerians and stuff like that, and the Elamites. So he takes over the whole thing, leaves his son in charge of Assyria, and then this is why you see 54 or 44 years, is because whether or not he's ruling in these last 10 years or this servant of Shem is ruling is disputed. Well, in that last 10 years of Naram Sin's reign, according to the Sumerians' kings list, is when the Gutians start invading. It's also when the Amorites start invading. And so what you seem to have going on is a consolidated, ordained by Shem overthrow of their kingdom by the Gutians in the west, which are basically all the Japhethites. They're not just the Gutians, okay? Nobody knows who the Gutians are, and the reason is because these are these hordes of Japhethites who came down from the mountains, from Oxus, to overthrow them. And then they keep that civilization pinned down for what seems to be like 50 years, and then they just go away, okay? Again, if these guys are controlling a quarter to a half of the world's population under their dominion, it's not going to be just some ragtag group of guys from the hills that overthrow them. Even if it's a substantial group, it's got to be a big, huge group of people. And the answer is that's because it is. It's the Japhethites. The Gutians seem to be the Japhethites, but the Japhethites are all mixed and mingled at this time. And the place where they're mixed and mingled is Oxus. So when you go to this BMAC complex, remember, the Hamites are going here to the Hindu Kush because they know that the lapis lazuli, the carnelian, the tin, all this good stuff that made the Canaanite civilization great came from here. In fact, they have this city, it's called Megar something, which is the oldest known city in the Harappan culture from before the flood. And it suddenly disappears around 2300, and they had all this advanced crafting and stuff going on here, okay? That city doesn't seem to get dug up after the flood, and so they're just like, oh, it seems to have disappeared, and people must have went to this other city a few miles away. Well, the reason is that other city a few miles away is what the Hamites seem to have dug up after the flood, and this other city stayed buried. So they find this city, and it's much older, and of course, your archaeologists are going to be like, oh, it's 10,000 years old beyond that, but it really is a city that was probably the main city that was gaining access to these metals and minerals and stuff like that among the Canaanites who first settled here. Well, these people who first settled here, this is what's going to happen. They're going to go here, and they're going to be able to export all these precious metals and minerals for extra money, okay? But they're going to have an abundance of these things for themselves because you can only export so much and get a good price. And aside from farming, you're not going to have a whole lot going on. Well, this Magar, and I got to find this city, oldest city in... Oh, it's just called Magar. Okay. So the Harappan civilization, this is going to be the oldest city, the OG city. This is in the Hindu Kush. See where it is up here in Pakistan? And this seems to be the main crafting capital of the Canaanites. Well, Oxus is going to be the same thing after the flood for the Japhethites. So what you have in this Magar is they find all kinds of pottery and stuff like this here, and they suspect that this thing goes back to 7,000 pre-7,000 BC. It makes no sense. Why would you have a city that's so stinking old? Again, genetic Adam came from the Niger Congo, but we can't really find much there before 1600 BC. But the Magar period, we can find stuff from 7,000 BC. That's metalcraft and highly advanced beyond anything in Niger Congo. Why? Because it's white people, y'all. This stuff lends very well to genetic racism if you understand what they're saying. And again, all this stuff is built, the older theories and all this stuff is built on the idea of favored races if you go back to the 1830s, okay? But you have the Magar period, and you see 3,500, and then you see this period 2,600 to 2,000. And this seems to be, it says, somewhere in this period, the city seems to have been largely abandoned in favor of Naharo 5 miles away. Well, why? Because between this and this is the flood, and 2000 BCE is around when the Hamites dig up the other city. So that's when they assume they just went from one city to the other. This would be around the time that the Hamites are digging up the Indus Valley civilization. And this guy suggests that the abandonment of the city took place around 2500. That's within 200 years of the flood. It took place at the flood, y'all. It's not that hard. And then you find the foods that they're cultivating are the exact same. And look at this, jujubes. Jujubes is not necessarily, but Enmer and einkorn wheat. That's the same stuff that they're cultivating in Sumer. Sheep, goats, and cattle, same stuff they're herding in Sumer. And then they've got the metals and the minerals and stuff like that are being shipped to Sumer that are all there. From 5500 BC, which is their wrong date, to 2600 BC. Okay. This is their estimate, but it's really it's the main supply of these things going to the Canaanites, which is why they're going to have lapis lazuli and tin for bronze and all this stuff going on everywhere. Okay, they're going to have these figurines of a sacred mother goddess. This is probably based on Eve. The Harappan civilization is going to have basically a fertility mother goddess and a guy named Lord of the Animals, which I'm going to suggest to you is just Adam and Eve. And then they're going to have this fig tree is going to be really famous, which is because they cover themselves up with fig leaves. So they assume the fig tree is the tree of life. That's what it seems to be. After, or the tree of knowledge, one of the two. So after they eat from the tree of knowledge, they're making clothes for themselves out of fig leaves, and these people seem to meditate under the fig tree, and this goes all the way into Buddhism later on. This whole idea of meditating under this Indian version of a fig tree. And they have these fig leaves all over everything. They have this pottery, and you see fish on the pottery. I don't know if people were eating fish back then. It's not necessarily that we would know that. But you have this guy named Oannes, which is like a merman, which is kind of a fish god. And then you have these later gods that have like a serpent lower half. And that seems to be based on the serpent in the garden. Oannes and all this stuff seems to be based on the serpent. And you just have a sea version of him where he has a fish bottom. And then you have a land version of him which has a serpent bottom. Those images aren't going to appear in India till much later. But the point is you see that they have copper stuff. You see that they have, they're burying their people. All this stuff is not terribly different from what they have in Sumer. And this is going to remain up until the Hamites start to dig that up. We'll now go to the Oxus civilization. They're going to have that other city is going to be down here, okay? And these are just basically the north and south side of the Hindu Kush area of the mountains of Afghanistan where they're mining for these tins and minerals, okay? Now, if you go to the book of Job, Job is going to tell you how, this is probably written around 1700 BCE, he's going to tell you how men are known to go throughout the earth and digging deep in the earth and finding all the mining and the minerals and stuff like that. So that seemed to be a major driver of where civilizations go. Again, Sumer is it because it's basically the grain belt of the world. They have farming and advanced farming, irrigation. But what seems to be driving them to their major civilization points are a few things. Where the mining and minerals are, where the easiest places to farm are, and where the civilizations were before the flood. They know where they are. They're beelining for them. They're inquisitive. They're digging up stuff in the archaeology. Oh, this has symbols on it. Can we read this? Well, Father Canaan can read it. Well, Ham can read it. And these are these special guys who knew how to read this stuff, and that's why they're famous all over. So you got Cush or Krishna, and you got Ham or Khnum, and then you've got Ham, or they call him Aminu, Amin, Ham. He's famous. And then you've got Khnum or Canaan. He's famous. And the whole idea of it is there's only a few guys who know how to read the pre-flood stuff when we find it. So when you find stuff, you got to take it to these guys who have these amazing powers and they live forever, and they know how to read the sacred writings that we find. And the sacred just means secret writings. It's the secret code. They know how to decode the code, okay? Well, the Japhethites aren't about that. The Hamites are all about digging up the old stuff. The Japhethites are about building towards their future dominance, okay? And so they're going to beeline for Cornwall, England, and Spain. And this is, you have pre-flood civilizations. When you hear these things about these, like, corded ware culture, okay? You're going to have all these cultures that people are going to talk about that are based on the Andra Novo and all this stuff. What they name them after common pieces of pottery or technology, maybe knives, maybe how they bury people. They just name them after that, okay? And they say, oh, this people is 1,000 years before these people, and these people are 1,000 years before these people. No, they're not. These are just different people groups that either trade with one another or don't trade one another before the flood. That's it. And so we know that there's cultures of people that are all the way over into Spain and England that have access to the tin mines of Spain and England before the flood. And so after the flood, Noah seems to tell the Japhethites where to go, and the Hamites seem to just follow. And so the sons of Tyrus, which become the Thracians and the Trojans, and the sons of Javan, which become the Greeks and the people of Tarshish and far away England and Spain, they are all beelining and setting up a trade route between Anatolia, which is the main place where the Japhethites are, their core territory, and the tin mines that they have access to. And the main starting point for them seems to be the area right by the ark. Makes sense, because these are the ones who Noah appointed to one day dominate the world. They're also given the horses. Now, the ones in the west are doing most of this by boat, but the ones in the east are given the horses. And what they're going to do is they're going to beeline for this civilization. This civilization starts within 50 years of them getting off the ark. Okay? So you're imagining Japheth is probably in his third generation by the time he goes over there and they start this civilization. This civilization starts 50 years later. You can imagine these guys, there might be a few hundred of them. Because again, Japheth could be popping out a kid every few years, right? And then those kids are popping out kids within 30 years. And next thing you know, you've got a few hundred people, okay? So they seem to leave a very fledgling colony near Armenia where Noah is, okay? And then a bunch of them go over here and start the civilization. And they start getting access to the same tin mines and stuff like this. And they're going to have this really good... I've got a book that's all about this, and I'm hopefully going to read the whole thing. But really good artwork and craft work. I mean, you look at this stuff. This is really old. This is a two-hump camel. So they don't just get the horses, these guys. They get the two-humped camels. The Semites seem to get the donkeys, because remember, you only have two of each of these things. You can't eat them, so they're not clean animals, which means you only have two of these things when you get off the ark. And the Semites seem to get the donkey or the mule or whatever, because remember, the mule is the donkey is a breed of a horse and a mule. Okay, so they get the donkey and the one-humped camel. The Japhethites seem to get the two-humped camel and the horse. So they've got a great pack animal, and then they've got the fastest riding animal. The Shemites have a slower riding animal, but a decent pack animal that's pretty fast in the camel, and so they're going to take over the deserts with those two, okay? Where these guys are going to have this pack animal that's going to go between Afghanistan and the Medes, okay? And then they're going to have the horses that can just go far and wide. And you see these people, notice you have this, it almost looks like a lion, but you see these very, very old stuff, and look at the detail on this. This is a two-headed eagle, which seems to be the symbol for Russia to this day. This two-headed eagle god seems to be between a boar and notice this is like got angel's wings on it, some kind of like a sphinx cherubim. Okay, whatever is going on here, this is very, very old stuff. 3rd millennium BC. Notice they've got gold and silver combined together, and look how much detail they have in this stuff. I mean, you've got the whole thing that has a shape of something, and you'll find pictures like this. And I don't know what these represent. I'm open to suggestions. You're going to find stuff like this among the Hindus, or in their ancient stuff, in the Sumerians, and these stuff, where you have some guy who's a deified somebody pushing two animals apart from each other. Maybe this is depicting Adam as the lord of animals. I don't know, but he's got two eagle's heads. And that, again, this is a symbol on the Russian flag. What does this represent? He's got two eagle heads, a man's body, and wings. This is some kind of angelic or Nephilim being. And then you've got this other beast right here. And then you've got this, which just looks like a regular animal. This may be a representation of something. Remember, there's two Yahwehs. There's a Yahweh in heaven and there's a Yahweh on earth. Okay? This may be a representation of like the angel of the Lord mediating between angels and animals or something. There might be some depiction there of this guy basically being the mediator, and that's why they're pushing these two apart from fighting. And you'll see this motif a lot, and it seems to be some higher god that is intermediating between a quarrel between lower gods. Well, it could be originally based on Adam, Cain, and Abel, or something like that, and then it turns into this god thing. But the point is this stuff is really old. This is 3rd millennium, 2nd millennium BC, so this would have been fresh off the ark, in those first centuries. And you look at how detailed the metal craft is. There's a horse, okay? Well, these people were known for burying people with their horses. That's how glued to their horses they were. The horses only belonged to the Japhethites until after the Tower of Babel. They're the only ones that had them. And the reason why Nimrod and these guys are conquering everything with just a few guys is because the guys with all the horses are very far away. If those guys could come with their horses and bows and arrows, just take them out. But they're very far away in Oxus. Their main civilization. You see their women would wear long and big dresses. So your European, remember how they have their big poofy dresses? This seems to go way back. And again, they're in areas that are colder. And back then, you probably had a receding ice wall. Because remember, the Lord is blowing the floodwaters north and south, which means you probably have big Arctic ice walls and you have an ice age going on. And so it's probably much colder up there. And they're going to mostly chill in this Oxus region. And this is why you see all their people, their women are shown wearing these big, thick dresses. So they dress modestly, but they're probably also dressed for the cold. They've got all kinds of bronze and iron tools, and you see them making little rings and stuff. They clearly know what they're doing with metal. These are not unadvanced people. But what they don't have is a writing system. They don't have a writing system, but yet they can craft all this amazing stuff. You'll find little symbols on some of their stuff, but it seems to be symbols that might represent people groups or whatever, but there doesn't seem to be a language or a writing system among them. Because remember, it's the Hamites who are digging up the languages. And so the Hamites are getting versed in language. They're on really hieroglyphics until Sargon, and then they get on what is called a syllabic script. So it's basically a script that makes a whole sound, like dog or cat, okay, versus something that's just a symbol depicting a word, okay? So they're there by the Tower of Babel, and after the Tower of Babel, you're going to have the Chinese language emerge among the Shang, which is a syllabic script, and then you're also going to have the Old Avestan emerge among these people, and that is a syllabic script. So guess what? These guys who are trading with the Gutians all the way down to basically where the Medes are, and then those people would trade with Sargon and his civilization. Well, that was going pretty well until they started attacking the Gutians and taking their herds. That seems to be what happens. So the Gutians have relations all the way with these guys here, because again, they're running Bactrian pack camels all the way here. That's how they're bringing the stuff that they're trading with them, okay? And it's tin and other things. And they're basically competing with these Harappans, which are Hamites who are trading with them. And there seems to be peaceful exchange with these guys going back and forth too, okay? Again, you're making money off these people. No one ever told them to hate one another, okay? You don't have wars between them. Anything in the archaeological record that we can see that these people were fighting wars before Sargon. Sargon tries to overthrow everything. The only other wars we have before that are before the flood. So when Sargon tries to overthrow everything, you're going to have war with these guys within a century. Okay, so it's not like the Japheth are just sitting there chilling and they're not going to get involved with this. It's going to be, Sargon is here, so you see 1920, and it's by 1829, so 90 years later, that's when the Gutians start coming in. Well, nobody really knows who the Gutians are, and they don't know what Guti means, okay? It's just this word Guti. But if the Old Avestan script is as old as scholars are starting to think it is, which is 1700 BCE, which is basically right after the Tower of Babel, they have this script, okay? The first thing they write in it are the Gathas, okay? The Gathas are the oldest script, or it's the oldest version of the Old Avestan script. It is also the original scriptures of the Zoroastrians. Zoroastrianism seems to be the OG religion of the Japhethites that emerged right after the Tower of Babel. And so this guy named Zoroaster is actually a modern Greek designation, and it might be a totally different guy. Might not be. According to let's see. This city, Ragas, is also known as Ray, Iran, is right here. This city, Ragas, which would be the Zagros Mountains, are over here. The Oxus civilization is over here, and right in between them is this place. They call it Shari El Rey right now, but it was called Ragis back in the day. This is the third city that's in Tobit. This is why it's so stupid, because Tobit talks about him going from Assyria, which is way over here, to Ecbatana and stopping in this city of Ragas on the way. Well, why is Ragas in it, which is way farther away than Ecbatana? Because it's the city where they believe Zoroaster came from, and they're writing in the Persian period, where Zoroastrianism is famous, and so the city he comes from is famous. Well, this city right between here is the traditional, from the Persian period, origin place of Zoroaster or Zarathustra, okay? Right in between the Oxus and the Gutians who overthrow Sargon, okay? Zarathustra, which is their original name in their Gathas, is this guy who basically is rallying the people against sacrificing animals. Remember, the Sumerians practice all kinds of augury, so they're sacrificing all kinds of animals, against sacrifice in general, against eating meat all the time. And it's going to be because of him, he's actually going to have, they're going to have in their culture a version of the bull of heaven, which is where they believe all the animals are descended from. And then they believe all men are descended from this guy named Geomart, which means mortal man, who is a skin-clad man. Then they believe there's 10 generations in this Pishdadian dynasty that takes them to the time of Zoroaster. Okay? It doesn't make sense if it's 1700 BC, but it does make sense if Zarathustra is Ziusudra. Okay? Ziusudra is another Sumerian version of Noah, and they have like 4 different guys that are supposedly names for Noah. One is Upatnashim, one is, they're right here, Atrahasis, and one of them is Ziusudra. Well, Ziusudra does not start to emerge in the writings of the Sumerians until after the Gutians invade. What I'm going to suggest to you that this is a transliteration of 2 words, Zeus, which means God, and Udra, which means flow or flood, god of the flood. And that is the origin of the name Deus or Zeus or Zeus, and Indra, which literally means Lord of the flood. So Udra means flood, Zeus means god, and Ziusudra is the Sumerians taking the Gutian version name for Noah, Lord of the flood, because Noah's dead by this time. They're not necessarily deifying Noah, but they might be. This Zeus might. Zeus just means heavenly, and so that might be heavenly flood, and they recognize it's the same person as Anu, because Anu is their version of Noah. So you have Anu, you have Atrahasis, you have Utapnashim, which I believe is really based on Shem. Atrahasis is not going to be written until after the Tower of Babel, and it's going to talk about a 6-year famine before a flood, which is actually Joseph's famine. Okay, it's 7 years in Joseph's famine because they're all the way in Egypt, but it's 6 years for them because they have that huge grain store from the Tower of Babel for the first year. And then you've got Utapnashim comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which those stories seem to emerge after the Sargonic period, but in Sumer, okay? So this seems to be the post-Babel version of them, and this is not Sumerian, this is Akkadian. This is the Sumerian version of him, and this is the Gutian version of him. So what we're looking at after the Tower of Babel is the Japhethite, the Amorite, and the Sumerian, the Japhethite, the Semite, and the Amorite titles given to, or the Semite title, the Sumerian titles given to Noah. And this means he who has found eternal life. This means greatly wise one, I think. And then this means to the Sumerians, they think it means something like this, like the Lord of long life or something like that, or the finder of long life. So it means the same thing as Utapnashim means to them, even though they're very different words. It doesn't make sense. Unless you understand it's just a transliteration of a Gutian term, which actually to them means heavenly flood or god of the flood. So Ziusudra, again, you're going to read this stuff and it's going to say this guy is as far as 2100 BCE. Well, he's not. They're just saying that because the Sumerians' kings list has Sargon and Naram-Sin 250 years before they are, because they're erasing the flood. That's what they're doing. And when you put them in their proper dates, which is 1920 to basically 1820, the Gutians start invading around this time, which means Ziusudra starts getting inserted among the Sumerians about 100 years before the Tower of Babel. Just 100 years before, which shouldn't be shocking that this is like within 100 to 150 years after the death of Noah, he is represented in some kind of god of the flood among the Japhethites who don't have a writing system. Shouldn't be shocking that they're honoring their ancestor Noah and they believe he's in heaven, so heavenly. He's the god of the flood, but he's really just, their belief that he's in heaven, essentially. And then after that, you see when the Gutians start to overthrow, you go back to being ruled by this guy who is a servant of Shem, Eri Shem, okay? The Amorites come in immediately, and then the first king that they try to put over Assyria is Shamshi Adad. And I'm going to suggest to you that he is not over Assyria, but he is over all of the Akkadian Empire after the Gutians overthrow it, or he is claiming rule of all of it. And Shamshi-Adad means, it seems to mean, Shamshi is the Semitic for Shem is Shamash, so they take out the vowel to shorten it. Shamash it means means my or mine, and Adad seems to mean authority or power or strength. Okay, so Shamash is my authority. So what are the Amorites doing? Remember, the Amorites are with Abraham when he gets blessed by Melchizedek for attacking and defeating Amraphel, which is Naram Sin. They take that as a signal to say we have been, and they might have legitimately been authorized by Shem to go take them out. And this plan, which seems to unfold within about 30 years of Abraham defeating Amraphel, they may have sent messengers all the way to the Japhethites on the other side of them to say, hey, Japheth is still alive, and Shem is still alive, and Ham might be still alive, but he's in India at this time. And they might have sent messengers all the way over to the Oxus civilization to get note to the Japhethites to say, hey, we need to overthrow these guys. We're going to start in the west. You guys start in the east. Overthrow these mofos. Okay? And what you end up having is the Amorites from the west and the Gutians at the same time. And I'm going to suggest to you that this is a concerted effort organized by Japheth and Shem. They overthrow Sargon. Or they overthrow Sargon's empire. And by the time of Naram Sin's son, they've destroyed Akkad. And then the Amorites come in and take over, and then the Gutians just leave. Because they're not interested in that territory. It's Shemite territory, and Shem seems to authorize the Amorites to, again, they're warriors, they're roughnecks, and they're friends of Abraham. So he seems to authorize them to take over, and then Abraham takes over for Heber as the guy who's just herding the flocks around him, that people who are righteous who are going up and giving sacrifices at Salem. The next guy after that means Ishmi Dagon, which means Dagon has heard. Again, these line up very well if you understand that these are the actual dates of Sargon, because Sargon is going to claim that Dagon gave him authority over all of the Mesopotamia, basically. It's going to be the northern parts of the Euphrates River. And so you're going to have Ishmi Dagon, which basically means the people of Mari are basically saying Dagon has heard and he's delivered them from Sargon's people. You're going to see something similar in Kish where it means Shamash has heard. Ishmi Shamash, which Shamash has heard. And then you go down to here and you see Puzur Sin, and they call him a usurper. Well, wait a minute. The Sumerians' kings list say Puzur Sin was the guy who was ruling before the guy that Sargon overthrew. And that's because the Sumerians' kings list is BS. The Sumerians' kings list is put together by, notice these guys, you're going to start seeing Bel Bani. Bel Bani basically means Bel, which seems to be a version of Cush, is the creator. You're going to see Adad in there, so you're going to see Shem in there, and you're going to see Shamshi in there. So Shem and Shamshi. This is Shem and Shamash. This is just Shem. Ishmi Dagon, you're going to see these names again and again, and we're all the way down here into the period of the Hebrew captivity, and most of these names seem to be based on Shamshi-Adad, Ishmi Dagon, Puzur Asher. Again, these are pretty basic names. There's not a whole lot of gods and theophoric names among them. But up here you see Iptar Sin. Sin still worshipped as a god among them, and remember, he gets imported over to the people of the Hurrians, which are just next door to the Assyrians. Okay? So if you look at that as legit, well, then it makes sense that when the Amorites start overthrowing them in the west, the Assyrians rebel and they say, we're under Shem's authority. So servants of Shem. Our king is called the servant of Shem. We are out from underneath Sargon's authority. We are under Shem's authority, and they break away. When the Amorites come in, the Amorites do not subjugate the Assyrians because the Assyrians are servants of Shem, and Shem's who they claim their authority is from. Again, they say their code of Hammurabi came from Shamash, the son of Anu. So you literally have Shem. Uri Shem is just the Assyrian name for Shem, while Shamash is the Amorite name for Shem, and probably the Akkadian name for Shem, because they were trying to make him, they were going to try to merge him with Utu to make him the sun god, which the Amorites do end up doing, okay? They already merged Noah with Enlil to make him the high transcendent god, and then they plan to, after Shem died, merge him with Utu to make him the sun god. At their day, when the Akkadians are ruling, they have Anu being the son of Nana, which is the moon god, so they actually put him under the bowl of heaven. And if you compare this to when Sargon takes over, he claims to take over under the authority of, he says he's the anointed of Anu, the king of the world, the governor of Enlil. So in other words, he is saying that Noah, who is under the authority of Enlil, which is God, it's basically the Heavenly Father, anointed him to take over the world. Okay? After he takes over, he merges the two into one person. And he does this under Enhenuada, who is basically the Horeb. She's the original mother of harlots. That's his daughter. Okay? So, all right. So, I took a little break here, but apologize if I overlap with this stuff. So, this Oxus civilization, where you see this intersection here of Q people, this is their genetics again. The R people, and then you see the P people. These are probably people that are related to Cushites, related to Sinites, and then related to the Japhethites. So if you see these people now, look at R. It's going to go up here to Russia. They're going to go up here into, these are going to be your Slavic peoples. You also are going to see these blue go up here. So these are probably Mongoloid peoples. That would be my guess, because you see them going all the way over here, and this is where the Celts go. But they also go up here in Russian people, okay? Now, they're assuming these are all just B lines, but what they're not really factoring in, because remember, they're assuming these are B lines over hundreds of thousands of years, and that's where they gradually merge. But what actually makes a lot more sense to this is that the Mongols come over here and intermarry with the Russians, and the Mongols come over here and intermarry with the Thracians and become the Celts, okay? So that's why you have these different people groups that are all over here. There's your Slavic peoples. You're also going to have Germanic peoples coming from here. And so these people groups, which you have here, you see this dark blue line here. Notice these people who come up from Ur. Well, that's Hebrews who come up from Ur. Well, what are they doing up here in England and Scandinavia and Denmark? Those are the Danites. That's what explains these lines here, okay? You see Göbekli Tepe, which is where they're kind of all merged, and you see some of these guys go from here up from Ur, and then they go over here to the Medes. These are your Hurrians that become the Mitanni. These are your the people who would have moved with Abraham and his family from Ur. They become the Urians. They merge with Mitanni. Some of them are going to go over here. They're going to merge with these Greek peoples, because these are the peoples who marry in with the Hebrews. And then you understand who else is in these people. Those are Danites too. Then you see these green peoples, these light green peoples, and they go from, notice they are over here in the Göbekli Tepe region, up here to where Noah's buried, down here to where the Semites live, and then over here, and this is just the Arabian conquest. These are the Hebrews that become the Arabs. So you see the people who would have been related to Noah. These are Haran and these people. They become part of the Mitanni, but some of them are related to the people who become the Arabs, and others are related to the Arabs that become part of the Arab conquest. So you have, in the Arab conquest, you have these Cushite peoples who are going to go over here, which become the Moors. This is Morocco over here. You see these Berbers over here. And what they're seeing is modern genetic diffusion that is way, way, way after the date. And they're saying, oh, that happened 50,000 years ago. That happened 60,000 years ago. No, it didn't. These Muslims started over here. They started out conquering this and this. And surprise, surprise, the people who became Muslims among them are going to go over here as the Muslims go over here, and they're going to take over this, but then they get pushed out. That's why their genetic type isn't there that much. They get pushed out and they get replaced with Frankish people, Gothic people, Gaulish people, and you're going to have a lot more genetics from Germanic peoples. See these light blue lines here? Remember the Anglo-Saxons, the Germans, but also the Danites are going to be mixed in with them. You see these dark blue lines here, how these dark blue line people here started out in but somehow they're up here in Scandinavia. That's the Danites. So you have Germanic people, Danite people, and then you have these people who are over here in West Europe, R1b, and they're also over here in Russia. These are probably going to be, again, I would guess are Celtic peoples, and then these ones in the east, this R1 is going to be Slavic people, and all those peoples which become Russians and Germans and all this stuff like that were once right here in this Oxus civilization. And then the ones of them that go to the east are going to be mixed in with these Sinites, which become all these Chinese peoples. And you're probably going to have earlier versions and later versions, and then you have these northern people that are mixed with Chinese, Sinite, and Mongoloid peoples are over there. And again, these are just their genes. These are not necessarily their tribal designations or anything. These are just their genes. And so you see these sea people, which are all over here and all the way into America. They're also in Australia. You have the same genetics. Notice you have C4 over here. You have C3 over here in North America. So you have people who are related to all the way back over here into Africa, Sumer, Southeast Asia, and Australia, and Oceania, like Papua New Guinea type area, all the way to Polynesia. Some of their genetic types is over here in North America. And the main, or North and South America. And the main people groups, you see C3, CB, these would probably be all Sinite, and then Q would probably be Zemarite. That would be my guess. Or vice versa. It could be the reverse of that. Those are going to be the main two people groups. And that's why when you look to the Olmec civilization, boy, they got people who look like broad-nosed, fat-lipped, and they got other people who look like they have Chinese eyes and very Chinese features in their little statues and stuff like that. Well, why? Because they're mixes of Sinites and Zemarites, okay? So we're going to leave that aside for now, but I'm going to keep referring to this as I move forward in my research and my book. I'm going to start putting together this idea, because if you move the timelines forward and you match up the Assyrians kings list, all of a sudden you have roughly 200 years between the death of Noah and this guy named, 150 years is all you have. 150 years between the death of Noah and this guy named Ziusudra popping up in Sumer as a name after the Gutians overthrow. And I'm going to suggest that the people of the Gathas, which means to recite, are Japhethites who are like the Muslims. Remember what the Muhammad, the angel, tells them when he makes the Quran? He says, recite, okay? Well, you have something similar going on with Ahura Mazda, which I don't think is God. I think this is some angel. And he is claiming to anoint Zoroaster to overthrow the previous civilization. And he has this king Vishtashpa who he converts to his way, who is going to organize this overthrow. And King Vishtashpa, obviously it sounds like a Persian kind of name. He seems to be the guy who is organizing this overthrow of Nimrod's kingdom, because you literally have these 10 kings that rule, which seem to be Adam down to Noah, or a version of them. And you've got all kinds of stories mixed up, because you have the flood like way up here, and then you have this guy who divides the land between his 3 sons kind of in the middle. So it seems like stuff that has to do with Noah is scattered amongst these different kings in these later legends. But you got to remember, these people didn't have a writing system. So they're going to telephone game and mix this stuff up. But they have this starter guy who's a skin-clad guy named Geomart, these 10 kings, and then this Ziusudra, or Zarathustra, who converts this King Vishtashpa to basically organize the spread of his religion through conquest, basically, just like Muhammad, okay? And this guy is going to seemingly rally all the Japhethites to go overthrow Akkad, because they see their civilizations with all their sacrifices as the source of everything, and they're going to become anti-animal sacrifice. And they're going to have this bull god, which is like the bull of heaven, but rather than being the father of the Nephilim, he is the father of all animals. And so this bull god becomes sacred to them, and this becomes the bull, I think its name is Bori, or there's this sacred bull that licks Bori, the god, and he becomes the father of the humans and the giants among the Scandinavians, or the Danish and the German. That's Thor and Odin, and that's their grandfather. And then he also is the reason why the Hindus worship the cow and they won't eat it. It's based on these Zoroastrians, which seem to influence the Aryans that invade the Indus Valley. Okay? Well, again, you crunch these timelines together and you realize, yeah, that's around 150 years after the death of Noah, when Shem and Japheth are still alive. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, Shem and Japheth are still alive 150 years after the death of Noah. Noah's going to live 350 years after the flood. They're going to live 500 years after the flood. So Shem and Japheth are still alive when Ziusudra appears among the Gutians who rule Sumer, and then the Sumerians are just going to transliterate the name to say that's Ziusudra, but the Japhethites are going to say it's Zarathustra. They pronounce it differently. But remember, this is after the Tower of Babel that the Gathas are written, and Zarathustra becomes this legendary prophet who did such and such. Well, who Zarathustra probably is, because again, Utapnashim is probably not based on Noah. He's a survivor of the flood who has long life. He's probably Shem. And Ziusudra may be based on Shem as well, because if Shem is the one who's the rightful king of the earth and he's organizing the overthrow of Sargon's kingdom, it would make sense that he would get word to the Japhethites, and it might take like 20, 30 years to organize this, but they're planning and they're organizing this overthrow, and it ends up being executed by the Amorites in the west primarily, with allies among the Aramaeans and the Assyrians, and that's why the Aramaeans and Assyrians are going to start to call their leaders stuff like servant of Shem. So they're submitted to Shem in the overthrow, and that's why they're helping the Amorites take over, and then when the Amorites take over, they try to become the next Sargon and build the Tower of Babel, but that's after Shem is dead. Okay? So while Shem is alive, they don't try to take over Assyria. They seem to be like liberators of these peoples from the Akkadians. And since they're still liberating more people, the people are helping them and basically submitting to their organizational administration. But by the time you get to the 1800s, and this is going to be, I believe, so the Tower of Babel is somewhere between 1730 and 1700. Okay? So we're 75 years shy of this. So I think Abraham's dead by this time. Isaac's alive. You have this guy, they say he's a usurper. So it seems like after Shem dies, this guy whose name means Shamash is my protector or authority. Shamash is my power, Shamash is my authority, seems to claim the rule of Assyria. And it seems to be like after Shem dies, that's when the Amorites start claiming we were given the rule by Shamash, just like Sargon is claiming I was given the rule by Anu. Shamash is Shem, the son of Noah, okay? And then they start listing these other guys who they say these are usurper kings, okay? And he has a son named Ishmi Dagon. Dagon is heard, so they're treating Dagon like he is a deity again. Mut, Asker, I don't know who this is. Ramush, who seems to be named after Sargon's son. Asinum. So this seems to be a line of kings starting in the 1800s. Well, this is around the period, if you look at the Amorites, the Amorites are going to set up these states called Katna, Babylonia, Yamad, and Mari. Okay? Here's the Assyrians. Remember, he's claiming rule over Assyria. And if you look at when these kingdoms are, This is during the time of the Hyksos, 1650 to 1580. Or I'm sorry, that's after that. These city-states start in 1764. So when does Shem die in our timeline? Shem dies, let's see. Our fact says born 2 years after the flood. Shem dies 400 years after the flood. So Shem is going to die in roughly 1796, maybe? This is 1764. 28 years after the death of Shem, these Amorite states are here and claiming to be there under his authority and ruling over everybody else. Okay? So we have kingdoms that were there before that, or we have city-states that were there before that. That's because these are a lot of the major cities that they're building on are pre-flood cities, so they would have pre-existed. And so you see stuff from 2500 to 2250, or, again, this is around, or 2500 to the flood. That's when they are. And they all suddenly disappear around 2550, which is the flood. The flood is roughly 2300, okay? They all suddenly disappear around this time. And then they get uncovered by, again, these are probably, could be Amorites, but probably Arameans after that. And then you start to see them, the Amorites, involved with moon god Nana. They have picked that up from the Akkadians. They take them over. Then they talk about this. My girlfriend, would you marry Martu? Who's Martu? Amar-Utu. It's Marduk. It's the forefather of the Amorites merged with Utu. And that's what they're doing after claiming Shamash gave them the right to rule, even though these people think Utu and Shamash are the same person. They're merging their ancestor with Utu. So what they end up doing is they basically start attacking the Amorites. Remember, they're wicked Canaanites too, and they like their system. They like how they do things, and they just start doing the same thing that they do. And so they're going to stay in charge until the Tower of Babel, and then they're going to get overthrown, and there's going to be these people that are called the Sea Kingdom or something like that. So it's another sea peoples who seem to come up from the Persian Gulf and take over them, and they think they were people who lived in the marshlands, but they weren't marshlands back then. They were well-controlled, well-irrigated farmlands that went to crap and became marshlands after the Tower of Babel. They were probably like that before the flood too, but they fixed them up and they turned them into irrigated, fields and stuff like that. So the Hyksos are going to get established in 1650. That's the Hebrews in Egypt. That's 100 years before their captivity. And these guys are going to be in 1764. That's 88 years before that. This is not a huge difference. 1764 to 1650. Oh, I'm sorry, that's 114 years difference. That's the Jews going into Egypt to the start of the Babylonians taking over. 114 years is not a long time. That's the generation of less than one person to a Hebrew. Okay? So in this period, you're going to have Mari is going to be the main capital. And it wouldn't shock me at all. I haven't done the research yet if Rabbi's name has to do with Ham. Wouldn't shock me at all. Ham, Abi's father. This is Akkadian. So it probably has to do with like Ham is my father or something like that. Or it could be Ham, Amur, Abi. So Ham and Amur are my fathers. Something like that. So where were we? Mari is going to be, again, they're going to try to link Mari before the flood to Mari after the flood. This is stupid because we know this place was overthrown by Sargon and then overthrown by the Amorites. So it's really dumb to think this is one kingdom. Your ancient Near Eastern archaeologists will not admit the flood, and they're so stubborn about this stuff, they're going to act like this was just the Amorite kingdom all along. The Amorites did not exist till after the flood. 1759 is when this gets overthrown. And again, we have 4 different chronologies. These chronologies differ by up to 150 years. That's how off these are, okay? But you definitely have chronologies that line up perfectly with the Bible timeline, if you pick the right chronology, okay? Now, 1759 is when they say this gets overthrown. Remember, I placed the Tower of Babel, and I believe this is the short chronology. It might be the middle chronology. Remember, I placed the Tower of Babel between 1730 and 1700. Okay, well, in 1759, Mari gets overthrown by, this is in their middle chronology, by Hammurabi, and it's after that then Hammurabi claims the whole of Babylonia. So Babylonia is essentially the city-state based on his city, and it used to be called Ki-Dingir-Ra, which literally means Gate of the Gods, and then the I think it's the Akkadian name. No, I'm sorry, that's the Sumerian name. The Amorite name seems to be, or the Akkadian name seems to be Babalu. So Ki-Dingir-Ra in Sumerian, in Akkadian is Babalu, and that's Babylon. And Babylonia, again, first starts being an administration of these Amorites under the kings of Mari, because they're a confederacy of different kings, just like Sargon's was, but it's basically 4 kingdoms ruled by different monarchs, all under the king of Mari. And then Hammurabi is going to overthrow Mari around the 1750s. And then after that, he is going to build his Tower of Babylon. Why is he building the Tower of Babel? Is really simple. According to Josephus, the ancient Near East believed in 600-year long cycles, just like the Mayan calendar long cycles. You're going to have these in China and in Mesoamerica, and it's the belief that when the planets and the stars line up in a certain way, that only happens every so many years, and it's going to keep getting longer. And the reason it's going to keep getting longer the further away from this you go is because the belief is that it's going to destroy the world, or some kind of cataclysm that's going to happen. And obviously it doesn't happen on schedule, and so they just keep changing it and extending it out and making it older and older and older, okay? You have a Hindu version of this, you have a Chinese version of this, you have a Mexican version of this. This is where your Mayan calendar comes from, okay? Well, the original OG version was this was a 600-year cycle. Well, what happened 600 years? What do you have between 2300 and 1700? The flood and the Tower of Babel. 600 years, okay? Why is he building his flood coming up on 600 years? Because they have sold the people on the idea that the flood is just something that happens periodically, and it's not something that was a judgment from God on just a one-time thing, okay? So the reason they believe this is because the Sumerians, Kings List, and Sargon and these guys have pushed the flood into the distant past, but they have other people who have their more recent flood that they still remember because their ancestors are talking about it and they're recording it. And so they say, oh, there's been many floods. That's why they're going to say this. And this idea is going to persist into the future, and we find it being promoted to Solon of Greece by the Egyptian priests around 600 BC. So about 1,000 years after this, they're still reporting this. Well, Josephus, writing around 70 AD, is saying the long cycle is a 600-year cycle that was recorded in these pillars that were dug up after the flood. And these pillars were put here on purpose for the people before the flood. Well, the pillars they're talking about are probably the pillars at Göbekli Tepe, which get reburied. Noah probably orders them reburied. And then they have other legends in the Book of Jubilees about tablets being found in a field that have all this mystery knowledge on them. And that's probably the cuneiform tablets they're talking about. And they probably get that from Canaan in Egypt, which is Canaan, who's the one who's digging up these tablets. Okay? So you have these very old stories, and they're playing telephone game, but at the end of the day, they believe that there's a 600-year cycle where you have a cataclysm at every time. And the Egyptians believe this. The Babylonians apparently believe this. Josephus believes this. And it's not true, But you have the 600-year long cycle. You have a 360-year long cycle that is among the Hindus, which is probably an earlier version of it. But what you have is around 600 years, he has a problem. Everybody thinks that these periodic floods are going to come through and destroy the region every 600 years, and we're coming up on 600 years. The rich and the well-to-do and the people with relatives elsewhere, remember, Babylon itself, and I've modeled this all out on ChatGPT using the biblical data about how big the earth is, and also matching that with the archaeological data about the population of Earth in this time. And the population of Earth at this time seems to be about 400,000 to 500,000 people. The population of Babylon alone seems to be between 10 and 50,000 people, depending on estimates, okay? It's a huge gap, I realize, but it could be up to a quarter of the people living right in Babylon, or at least a quarter of the people in this imperial region here, which makes sense, because if you fast forward to Rome, that's about how much Rome was of the world's population. It was about a quarter of the world's population. So you have Babylon itself having maybe between 5 and 10% of the world's population, or it could be 2 and 10%, and then this whole kingdom having about a quarter of the world's population. And so, surprise, surprise, they're worried coming up upon the 600-year calendar date that the people are going to disperse from their kingdom, which is where all the money and taxation is coming in, because of their fear of the flood. So what do? They say, right in Genesis chapter 11, they say, let us bake brick and burn them thoroughly, because they already have these waterproof towers around them. They know how to do this. And then they're going to have slime for mortar, which is bitumen. And they say, let us build a city and a tower that's top is unto heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad on the face of the whole earth. The name they make for themselves, these are the Amorites, is Marduk, Amarutu. In other words, they're making a god name for themselves to identify the Amorites, okay? Because the Amorites are really spread from Canaan to Babel, and they're not the primary people group in anywhere where they're ruling. And if their kingdoms just scatter away, what they have is a bunch of sparsely populated people with nobody serving them that are spread out, and they're 4 different kingdoms. So they make a name for themselves, and that's Marduk or Amarutu, which is their forefather merged with Utu. That's the name they make for themselves. The tower is flood insurance. They're telling people, we're going to build this huge tower, and you can just get in the tower, and when the periodic flood comes and washes everything away, you'll be safe in the tower. We'll store food in it and all this stuff, and just like the ark, and everything will be washed away, and you guys can rebuild. You can just go to the tower. You don't have to move away. You can just move closer to Babylon, and you'll be fine. That's why they're building a tower. And this is what goes down through Jewish history as what Nimrod did. This is not Nimrod doing this. Nothing in here says Nimrod's involved with this. The only thing it talks about is Shinar. But because there's so little in here, and because it's after the story of Nimrod, who rules in Shinar, the Jews assume it's Nimrod, okay? And so they're saying, lest we be scattered abroad in the face of the earth. Why? All the other Canaanites are scattered abroad. The Amorites are scattered between Canaan and here in Babylonia. That's a pretty big dispersal. So they would just be a minority people group, and if the people aren't following them because they can't protect them from the flood, well, then they just diminish and become nobodies, okay? So what they do is they create a god, they create a tower, and then the people start moving towards Babylon where the tower is. And Babylon keeps getting more and more dense and big. They build these big, huge walls around it. It becomes this mega city like nothing the world has ever seen. And this tower just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because the more people who want to move there, the more people are like, well, we need a spot in the tower. Well, we need to make the tower bigger. And they just keep making it bigger and bigger and bigger until it consumes the whole economy. And by that time, they're taking herds from their surrounding peoples. And this is the time where you have Job getting raided by Chaldeans, which are from this region. They take his herds. And Sabaeans, these are the people who are the relatives of Sargon. The Sabaeans take his herds too. You have these people going around taking slaves, taking herds, taking food, and just basically everything is going into the slave economy of building this tower. And it's at that point where the Lord steps in and he says, look what they've begun to do. Even though he's promised not to destroy the world with a flood, they're building this massive tower as flood insurance against him doing it because they believe the flood's coming back. And so he scatters their languages. And when does he do this? Somewhere between 1730 and 1700 BCE. Around the same time Joseph goes into Egypt and is using an interpreter for the first time. After that, you're going to have two new languages. You've already had Sumerian and cuneiform, and the Harappan language seems to be a Canaanite language that nobody knows. But everybody seems to know cuneiform, Akkadian cuneiform, and Egyptian hieroglyphics. Okay. After the Tower of Babel, you're going to have a few new languages emerge. One is going to be the Chinese script. It's going to emerge within about 50 years of the Tower of Babel, maybe 100. You're going to have the Proto-Hebrew script, which is going to emerge. They believe Joseph invented this, which is going to become all your Phoenician alphabets, and it's going to become the basis. It's going to be a different script. The Aramaic script is going to come later, but it's the same letter sounds. They're both based on the Hebrew language. The Aramaic, remember, the Arameans are mingled in with the Hebrews, okay? So that's why they have such similar alphabets. They look different, but the sounds are similar, and they actually do have some of the same characters, okay? So you're going to have the Proto-Hebrew, which becomes the basis for the Aramaic and the Phoenician alphabets, which are going to spread all throughout Europe and Asia. Linear B is just kind of like a language that's used among the Greeks, Linear A and Linear B, that seems to be just more of like a trade script that is invented by the Hebrews and Egyptians for trade with them. That becomes the basis for the language, but the actual script really comes from the Phoenician. Over in the east, you're going to have Old Avestan, which becomes the basis for all your scripts that are have a certain style, and that style becomes the Persian style. It also becomes the Arabic style, okay? The Arabic language is going to be more like Aramaic and Hebrew, but the alphabet style is going to be more like Persian, because the first thing they do is conquer the Sassanid dynasty. And then you're going to have those scripts are also going to become the Indo-Aryan scripts. They're going to be similar in style, okay? And then you're going to have the Chinese script, which is going to be similar in style to Akkadian cuneiform. It's going to be a syllabic script of symbols, but the symbols are going to be very different because they're scratching these symbols into bamboo, bone, and turtle shell rather than pressing them into clay. So the cuneiform just had a reed that they would press into clay, and it just has a fat end and a skinny end because it's basically a reed. And they'd press it into clay, and it would make these symbols that were like thick on one end and a point on the other end. And all their symbols are made of that, where the Chinese, you need a harder scratch going into a surface. And so their symbols start out as these scratches, and then they eventually turn to calligraphy once they get into pen and ink. Okay? So you can just tell all these languages are going to emerge within a century of the Tower of Babel. All the scripts are going to emerge. And then those handful of scripts, or a script that is based on those scripts, becomes the basis for all the other alphabets in the world. And Akkadian and Sumerian cuneiform, Akkadian cuneiform stays very prominent in the Middle East until basically the Assyrian Empire makes Aramaic script the new alphabet for the whole Middle East. Because the Assyrian Empire is the first to really reestablish an empire as widespread as Sargon's or as Babylonia, and they were using Akkadian. And Assyrians, by that time, their first core group are going to be the Arameans of the Aram Naharim, and those people are going to have the Aramaic script, and it's going to work for them for years, and it's going to become the basis for their administration, and then it's going to become the widespread language of the Near East when the Assyrians take over. The Babylonians are going to take over, and they're just going to keep using it because they were using it before. And then the Persians are going to take over, and they're just going to keep using it in the Middle East because it works for everyone in the Middle East, and why reinvent the wheel if everyone knows how to use the script? So that's basically where all your languages happen, and it's right after that. So again, after this literally like 100 years after the Tower of Babel, you have Tang the Nephilim show up in China with these other Chinese, and they move a version of the Sumerian religion with its divination and its augury and its human sacrifice and all this stuff over into China. And that is going to remain the most powerful empire in China, the Shang dynasty, until around 1000 BC. So around the time of maybe King Saul's rise to power. Basically the end of the period of Judges. And they're eventually going to be opposed by a Zhou dynasty, which claims to be the inheritors of the Ji dynasty. So the Zhou dynasty is, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but the Zhou dynasty is going to overthrow them based on the same mandate of heaven, and they're going to be the main dynasty until 256 BC. And there's other dynasties, there's other kingdoms in China, but this is going to be the main, most prominent one. So they're going to be overthrown. The Shang are going to be overthrown by the Zhou in 1046, and they're going to remain until about a decade or so before the Han dynasty. The Zhou seem to be Chinese. The Han seem to be people who are closer genetically related to the Mongols. Remember, this is all in Inner Mongolia, and right next to here is going to be the Han. And it's going to be these Han that seem to divide off Goguryeo and take over this and name it Manchuria. And then they seem to be the ones that wall off the Great Wall of China. And these ones that are more Japhethite understand, like, we don't want these incursions from the Mongols. They like the Chinese culture, but they ban all the human sacrifice and stuff like that. And then that is the people who are ruling at the time of Christ. So it's, again, you have other kingdoms, you have these warring states periods, and you have these other states around China, but the dominant one goes from being the Ji to the Shang to the Zhou to the Han. That's basically it. And that's most of it. And so they have the same way of heaven, and again, the veneration of ancestors, which would have been very, very OG Sinite Sumerian worship styles based on a parent's house becoming a temple or a shrine to them after they die, and it's inherited by the elder and eventually just becomes a temple on its own, would become the basis for Chinese ancestor worship, and it would get overlaid with the pantheistic worship of the later Sumerians and Akkadians when the Shang came, and then that would diminish back away from that, and they would start to get in philosophical forms that are mostly based around ancestor worship. And those even though records of those various gods exist, you don't have a strong pantheistic cult worship in China after that. It's almost like the Zhou roll back the things that the Shang does, and by the time you get to the Han, it's more Japhethites, and the Japhethites don't have a lot of gods. They're more into philosophy than they are into pantheism. And then you have the Mongols and guys like that mostly just worship the storm god. It's mostly just their version of Yahweh appearing in the storms of Job. Again, remember, that's going to transmit to the Japhethites right away after the tower, or right around the time of the Tower of Babel. And the idea of a storm god is their main god. Again, Thor, Darius, Zeus. I think the Mongols call him Tengiru. Is going to be their god, while the Chinese, based on the Shang, are going to bring Shangdi, which seems to be the deified sign. Shang, it's Shandi, but the earlier pronunciations were Shang. That's where the Shang dynasty gets its name, but it's actually just Shandi, which is sign or suen deified. Di or Deus, God, and to them meant the high god sign. Well, remember, in the Sumerian system, sign was made the high god in the Akkadian system. And so the Sumerians are going to keep going on that because that's where they came from. So, again, you guys, this stuff is going to be hopefully much better written and organized when I get to my Serpent by the Way book. I've got around 130 pages written, and I keep consolidating and eliminating and reducing and reorganizing and stuff like this. But this is going to, if you love history and you love the Bible and you're like, I believe history should match the Bible, this is going to be basically a pocket ancient history that's going to cover linguistics, it's going to cover genetics, it's going to cover scripts, it's going to cover comparative mythology, and it's going to cover history from the time of Noah to the time of Christ. And hopefully, if you guys, again, I would recommend, if you're like, hey, I might be interested in this, read my Rightly Dividing book, because it essentially does that with church history. And a lot of reading went into it, and this is going to connect to that. And when you connect these two together, you're going to be like, oh, wow, that's like 700, maybe 750 pages of reading total that's going to cover 4,000 years of history. And it's going to make sense. It's going to connect the dots, and the stuff's going to go together in a way that makes sense. So it's also going to be a great companion to you reading the Old and New Testament. So anyways, I hope you guys are blessed by this. Enjoy your 4th of July. Don't do anything too crazy. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.